So now let's us turn to Armenia. We have here with us Professor Raffaella Simonelli that teaches at Politecnico di Milano. She went in Armenia in 2012 and 2013 for the previous training project that the Politecnico di Milano implemented in Armenia with the financing of the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And she works usually with Professor Maria Cristina Gianbruno that sadly couldn't be with us today. And the two are always interested in focusing on urban design and conservation of architecture, heritage and landscape, and have a huge experience working also not only in Italy, but all over the world. And Armenia was only one of the venues for their work. So please, Professor Simonelli, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Gaiane. On behalf of Professor Maria Cristina Gianbruno, who unfortunately cannot be present with us today, I welcome you all. I will briefly introduce her communication and then move to mine, describing what we mean with active knowledge and showing some Armenian case studies. Please let me know if you have difficulty to understand me, okay? Now I'm sharing my presentation. Okay. Intervention in historic urban cores have been a debated subject through the years. The ancient part of the cities was seen, as now in some cases, as an obstacle to the development of a modern city, functional to the needs of contemporary life. But are really the historic parts of the cities an obstacle? Or could they be as a source for contemporary living? In the so-called historic centers, we find some of the main characteristics that give quality to a city: green spaces, pedestrian areas, museums, libraries, theaters, shopping areas, monuments. Through the historic structure, we can read and understand the identity of any place, its culture, its people, and the everyday history. We have to consider a city a diachronic system where every time left its mark, sometimes in continuity, other time in discontinuity with tradition. You can see some images like the ones Professor Pretelli showed about Sventramenti, for example. So the historic city must be considered in its complexity as a composed entity in constant evolution, which represents at the same time the reflection and the spirit of the society that is living in it, where monuments, widespread heritage, and the network of relationship coexist and make every site unique. Without historic urban tissues, we lose our history, and our cities miss identity and globalize themselves. As we can see, for example, in this photo that shows an ancient district of Milan called Niguarda, completely replaced by new buildings. How can we manage the necessary transformations? How can we combine conservation and transformation of existing city while respecting the identity of the place in every form and manner? How can we take into consideration all the values ingrained in the past, assuring at the same time a coherent development in our cities? We should therefore reflect on the opportunities that the historic urban tissues give to the city as resources to be conserved, rehabilitated, reused, and involved in development strategies of the towns, in projects able to respect and enhance their features, to integrate them into the contemporary city. A diachronic, not a synchronic city that preserves the signs of the past, making them work together with the new ones. As we said, it is necessary to valorize the identity of the site and to preserve its existing heritage without losing its features as traditional settlement. For these reasons, we would like to focus on the knowledge process, which we consider a fundamental phase for the intervention on historic urban tissues, to become aware of their stratified asset, cultural heritage, and identity. So it is important to define an iter of study that outlines the procedures to be followed in order to reach a knowledge of urban system, a sort of identification of key points that we usually call restriction or customizable degrees, from which deduce correct guidelines for its preservation and valorization, revitalization. This knowledge phase assumes a key role in directing the design choices that will affect the future of the site, identifying problems and potentialities, strengths and weaknesses regarding conservation and development, following its vocation. I'd like to stress this word, like the genius loci mentioned by Professor Danuta, for example. This is a possible study method configured to urban reality, which has to necessarily take into account the numerous stratified elements that make it unique. How to develop techniques of knowledge configured as a valuable support to inherit to future generations this resource in its entirety? The approach, which must be suited on the different situations, avoiding dogmatic approach, aims to record and decipher as much information as possible, even those seemingly insignificant, necessary for a full understanding of each society. We have to respect all the marks that man and time imprinted on the city, widening our vision and refusing the personal preconceptions. It is necessary to develop a working program that progressively decreases of scale, such as rapid surveys that act as alarms for the historic city in its complexity, providing forced and qualitative information about the possible critical issues that have to be investigated with further and more in-depth knowledge projects. A possible way consists in enhancing curiosity, developing knowledge, distinction, and some overlap interaction, and forming a subsequent synchronic reading of the constituent elements in order to create a substrate that would guide the consequent analysis to the design phase, respecting and supporting the specific characteristics of what is considered the vocation of each site. Finally, considering that the same users modify the city, it will be necessary to operate on them by increasing their level of knowledge in order to spread the ability to understand and therefore to respect the complexity of the urban structure, to transmit coherence and specificity to the future. Oops, I'm sorry. Now I would like to present some studies we did in Armenia in the context of the master conservation design during the 2-year period where we tested our approach. The opportunity provided to experience this kind of approach to historic tissues of Yerevan and other cities like Gyumri and Sushi, for example, allowed us to compare ourselves with local professionals and inhabitants and to identify and calibrate the iter to the specificities of the sites. The first significant for us study case in Armenia concerns Nork, a small village of the 19th century, now a district of Yerevan, set on the northeastern hills surrounding the city, as you know. Historically functional and administrative autonomous, in 2012, Nork presented itself in a progressive state of neglect and decay, compounded by difficult transport connections to the city center. I refer to the period in which we worked there. The building, made of simple materials and techniques, often devoid of decorations, testify by their presence the material culture of the site. This heritage, representative of a whole community and not of facts and exceptional events, undergoes substantial changes every day, minute transformations caused in some cases by the lack of understanding of the role that these buildings have for the history of a community, and often due to adjustments considered necessary to improve the conditions of life on those who live there. Small changes that add up one by one hide or obliterate the historic substance of the site. Historically characterized by small units of 1 or 2 floors, as you can see, with open spaces of relevance often used as yard, garden, and orchard, in many of these blocks is still detectable the presence of historic pergolas that testify, along with cellars within the houses, a use that has always characterized the life of this district, which it is quickly losing. The adopted approach takes cognizance of the complex nature of the district through the knowledge of building elements and open spaces, evolutionary process, transformations, to identify problems and resources. The qualitative course is organized in different levels of investigation, which correspond to different scales of intervention and subject matters. The preliminary studies consist of obtaining, with data sheets, a general knowledge of the site and includes historic documentation to understand and illustrate the territory evolution during the time, and analysis to identify functional characteristics, morphological aspects, material and pathological properties. The data sheet specifically made for this investigation can be easily actualized and represents a way to reach a minimum level of knowledge. On the right, you can see an example of a thematic map that shows and highlight the collected information for a sub-area of Nork. This initial mapping of the site allowed us to better understand the urban system, to stress critical points and potentialities, to identify key areas and elements, customs, traditions, useful for future projects. At the same time, in this phase, it can be analyzed the strengths to be highlighted and increased in a preservation and management project. The next step will take into consideration the problems emerged from the analysis undertaken at the previous level, and it eventually focus on the areas which have been identified as mostly damaged and which therefore require immediate attention and intervention. The new survey could be, for example, visual analysis of the exterior state of the building, inspection of interiors for structural condition, usability, state of conservation and use of the open spaces. Far from being an exhaustive knowledge of the historic district, this proposed analysis can constitute a process of preliminary reading, an initial analytical hitter to a respectful project that leads to understand and interpret the macro phenomena taking place in this context, highlighting at the same specificities, potentialities, and criticalities. Therefore, the tiny tissue that composes the city must not be seen as a negative constraint, but as a resource. Fruit and grape gardens, wine cellars present in the basement of the buildings testify a tradition which characterizes the district and represents the vocation of the area. For example, it might be interesting to valorize these characterizing elements by preserving, noticing, and sharing them also through a cultural trial, an itinerary. It is obvious that this kind of study doesn't want to simply record the state in which Nork was. The aim is rather to show how important it is to ensure that Nork, although it is susceptible of modifications and adaptation, will maintain its identity over time, stratified on the buildings and on the road network, on the use that the inhabitants have made during the time, and they must be able to continue to do. This kind of approach, supported by the investigation, knowledge and contact with the inhabitants, cannot be separated from a process of sharing of ideas with the actors that define the lines of development of the city. From a didactic point of view, the awareness of the value of their cultural heritage and identity, also felt in the district of Nork, obtained by studies and surveys shared with the residents, has meant that the entire group of students could understand the need to work in the district with a different view, which aims to manage the necessary transformations with more caution toward the historic fabric, its articulation, the use, and the specific characteristics that Nork continues to show to a keen eye, respectful and aware of the value of its stratified identity. Now I would like to show another example in which more detailed studies can be conducted on the scale of an urban block in Yerevan, for which there was an idea of a project. Here we worked with two very good architects, our master students, analyzing every building and open space, carefully highlighting elements and problems. Here you can see, for example, some studies like building and open spaces analysis. Up to an overall evaluation of the general state of conservation, from good state to present of superficial decay to structural problems, and a map of historic elements still present there. These information have been located and became the starting points for a project aware of the remaining values still present in situ. So you can see, for example, a deepened survey of peculiar elements and the real state of conservation to locate and understand the distinctive components, wooden balconies, facades, entrance, windows, doors, to respect and conserve in a future project. I'm finishing. A kind of points not to be touched, considered prerequisites for the project. At the same time, the presence of situation of severe decay could be considered as a resource, as collapses of horizontal and vertical link structures allow, for example, a free internal distribution of the building. A series of suggestions useful for the project. I hope I have managed to tell you about some experiences and to transmit some good inputs on which to reflect for a respectful and correct setting up of the historic sites and their necessary transformation. To work in historic districts with carefully eyes and without personal preconcepts to increase their own knowledge, to respect the stratified heritage, to involve local communities, to take into consideration the whole values ingrained in the past as much as possible, to manage the necessary transformations with more caution towards the historic districts, considered as resources for a current development project. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Simonelli, for these precious inputs and for the inputs also on the methodology that should be used to study and to preserve our cultural heritage in the urban districts and urban context.